Cool. All right, great. And can both of you hear me? Oh, we have five people are not showing up on my screen. Great. Can everyone hear me? All right. So before we get started with critical reasoning content, how many of you have started preparing for the GRE or are just waiting to get started? Very cool. How are you finding it so far? A lengthy, yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Jordan, you're using TTP already. How are you liking it? Quant is super thorough, which it kind of has to be because there's a limited set of quant questions that you have to answer, but there's a huge pool of concepts that you need to be aware of they could ask you about. So of course we need to make sure that you're fully prepared so you don't get to the exam and run into something you haven't seen before or a concept you've seen before, but it's tested in a different way. The thoroughness does pay off, even though it does feel like a slog at times. All right. Before I launch my slideshow here, I'm going to go ahead and drop my email address in the chat. So if you guys have questions afterwards, or want more information about preparing for the GRE or about working with Target Test Prep, you can definitely contact me that way. I'm always happy to help out. As you can see, I'm Bill. I'm not Scott. Scott is the owner of TTP. I'm one of the instructors and curriculum specialists. So yeah, Bill at targettestprep.com, and we'll get started. All right. So, how to master critical reasoning, which, if you're familiar with the GRE, and some of you have taken it or started preparing for it, you might be wondering, why does this actually matter? I mean, there's not that many critical reasoning questions, right? Maybe a couple. There are a few reasons it makes sense to actually develop your reasoning skills, and it can have a surprisingly big impact on how well you perform on test day. First, it's not just the couple of critical reasoning questions that you're going to use these skills for. Yeah, one or two that are pure critical reasoning, and we'll talk about the different types that you can encounter on the exam. But you'll also see regular reading comprehension questions asked along the lines of critical reasoning questions. You might have a longer passage, and it might ask you, what would strengthen the author's conclusion about something discussed in the passage. Beyond that, the essay you have to write is essentially a long form critical reasoning question. Sadly, you don't just get to pick one answer for it. You have to develop your essay, but thinking about it in terms of critical reasoning and analyzing an argument, definitely a good way to go to make sure that you're hitting the points that you need to earn a good essay score. Other verbal types also use critical reasoning skills. So your sentence equivalence, text completion. Yeah, there's a lot of vocabulary to know for those, but you also have to be comfortable with the reasoning involved. So a lot of times, the difficulty is not picking the right answer from your options. It's figuring out what the sentence needs from those spots to actually make sense. So if you can use a little bit of reasoning there, a lot of times that'll make our lives a lot easier. And in some questions, even if we're struggling with the vocabulary and the answer choices, we can still get the right answer because we can eliminate the ones that clearly don't work, and we're picking the one that is the only possible candidate that could make sense in that context. And on the quant section as well, occasionally you'll see some questions where you're going to really be glad that you have some strong reasoning skills. Obviously, you have to have the math skills and understand all of the concepts that could be tested. There's no way around that. But especially with the word problems you encounter, being trained to read analytically and carefully and interpret what's being presented to you can definitely make it a little bit easier to figure out how you should solve the problem. So with critical reasoning on the GRE, there are 6 main question types you'll encounter, roughly in order of commonality here. By far the most common are identify the assumption questions, weaken the argument questions, and strengthen the argument questions. Less commonly, you might be asked to resolve a paradox presented to you. Complete the passage. In that case, you'll see the passage has its blank at the end, and you have to figure out, based on the context of the passage, what kind of information it's looking for. And inference questions, where we get to draw the conclusion ourselves. I tend to like those. Some people don't. That's one thing you'll notice as you get into GRE studying. If you've developed a favorite critical reasoning type, then you're definitely in GRE mode. It's kind of scary when it happens, but also kind of interesting. Now, as far as how critical reasoning questions look, you get your stimulus or passage. We kind of use those interchangeably. That's the argument of the information that we need to analyze. Typically 90 words or fewer, so very short compared to some of the reading comprehension passages you'll be asked to read and analyze. And the information we see there forms the argument the author is making. So we'll talk about these in more detail in a little bit, but you'll have some background information that kind of sets the stage for what the author is doing. You have your premises or evidence that the author is citing to support the conclusion that they've drawn. Below that, you'll see a question stem, which identifies exactly which critical reasoning type we're facing. We can pick up on a lot of keywords there to figure out what we need to get out of the passage, what we're trying to accomplish with the answer choice. And we're going to adjust our focus based on which type we identify. We'll know exactly what we need to do with that particular question. And finally, 5 answer choices, 1 correct one, 4 incorrect ones. And each type has different criteria because we're trying to accomplish something differently by selecting an answer choice based on the type that we've identified. Here's a sample critical reasoning question. I'll give you a minute to go ahead and read through it, but we've got our argument about sales of figs. Pretty exciting topic. The question stem, which says, which of the following, if true, provides the most additional support for the conclusion of the argument? So this is what we'd classify as a strengthened question. We want to identify the author's conclusion, understand why they've drawn that conclusion, and then we'll go to the answer choices and figure out which one we think does the best job of making us think that the author's conclusion is likely to be true. Go ahead and read through the passage. I'll give you a minute or so to do so, and then we'll discuss. All right, we've got a couple of votes for D here. First off, what is the author's conclusion here? Yep, you're exactly right. It's the final sentence. And we do have a good clue there at the start of the final sentence. This is something you'll learn as you study critical reasoning. You have words that signify conclusions and premises. So when we see the word clearly, we know that whatever is going to follow is going to be the conclusion the author is drawing. So the reason for the increases in fig sales is the video game's portrayal of figs as a source of power, which sounds kind of silly, but I also remember when I was little, the first time I saw a Popeye cartoon and saw him eat spinach and get really strong, I begged my mom to go to the grocery store and buy some spinach so I could have it for dinner and get super strong. It did not work, sadly. All right, so we've got the author's conclusion. Figs got popular and increased in sales because the video game made them look super cool. What evidence do we have to support that idea? Why does the author think that's the case? We've got the first sentence there, which is context. Yeah, it's the piece we need to complete. We've got one piece of evidence, which is really just a correlation. Just before the increases in fig sales began, a new video game was released in which characters became powerful by eating figs. So we've got kind of a synchronicity between the two events here. A video game came out and made figs look like they'd make you strong, and then figs started increasing in sales. So it's kind of a correlation here. These two events occurred, so obviously one must have caused the other. Our job is to figure out what makes that conclusion more likely to be true. What would give us reason to think that it actually is the video game that caused that increase in fig sales and not any other potential cause? So choice A, we have, because fig trees can thrive in a range of climates, it is possible to grow figs in many areas of the country. Why doesn't that one work? Well, we know that what we need to do here is connect those two events a little bit better. How do we connect fig sales? You're exactly right, Grace. That's the key point to take away from choice A, is that we need to connect the increase in fig sales to the video game a little bit more strongly. Choice A doesn't mention the video game or fig sales at all. It just talks about growing figs, which, okay, that's good to know. You can grow it anywhere. So maybe we can grow a lot of figs that would meet the increased demand for them, but it doesn't give us more reason to think that the video game is actually responsible for that sales increase. So it's no good. How about choice B? Sales of blueberries also have increased recently. Yeah. As much as I love blueberries and I'm partially responsible for this increase in blueberry sales, it still says nothing about figs in the video game. It has no relation to what the author's argument actually is. So go ahead and get rid of that one. Yeah, we'll get to a couple of more difficult ones a little bit later after we talk about how to approach them. This is just to get our feet wet. Choice C, sales of both fresh figs and dried figs have increased recently. What does that do for us? Well, not a whole lot. It does give us more information about the increase in fig sales. It's not just one kind of fig, it's both kinds, but it doesn't connect it to the video game. So it doesn't help support the author's point. Go ahead and get rid of that one. Choice B, sales of figs have only increased in areas of the country where the new video game is popular. That was the one that we had some votes for. What's so compelling about choice D? Why does that work for us? You're exactly right. From the author's argument originally, we just know that these two things happen in correlation with each other. Video game came out, fig sales went up. There's no direct connection between the two events. But choice D, limiting these increases to only areas where the video game is popular. Now we have some additional reason to think that it actually is the video game that made figs look really cool. If we have an area where the video game is popular and that's where fig sales went up, that's a pretty good connection. And conversely, we would know that because of the word only, in the areas where the video game was not popular, we don't see that same increase in fig sales. So we've got a better case for a cause and effect relationship, with cause being the release of the video game and the effect being the increased fig sales, because now we have areas where the cause is present and the effect was also present. But we also have some areas of the country where when the cause was absent, the effect didn't occur. And that gives us a little bit more reason to think that, yep, it's the video game that caused that increase. So it's a good choice. And choice E, figs are sources of important nutrients and antioxidants, which I think that answer might have been written by my mom. I know she likes figs and talks about nutrients and antioxidants, so very possible she's a contributing writer and just hasn't told me that. But it's got a similar problem to choices B and C in that it's great to know that. Maybe we could stretch that and say that that's why they became more popular and fig sales have gone up recently. That is still kind of a stretch though, because that statement has always been true of figs. It's not that recently figs became a good source of nutrients and antioxidants. That's been true all along, as long as we've had figs. So we could stretch it to make it a weakened answer and say, hey, maybe there's an alternative cause for the recent fig popularity, but it definitely doesn't strengthen because it doesn't connect figs to video games at all. We can get rid of that one. We're going to go with choice E. Now I want some blueberries. Does this question make sense to everyone? Cool. All right, we'll keep moving. Oh, gotta clear my drawings. So in terms of what we need to be good at in order to do well in critical reasoning, I would break it down into 4 key skills that we need to develop. First, attention to detail. A lot of the keys to doing well with critical reasoning, especially on the harder questions, is noticing exact wording and subtle connections between statements in the author's argument, and picking up on exactly how answer choices affect the argument of the passage. Secondly, careful, clear thinking. You've got to consider implications of the statements given in the passage, what the author is actually trying to do with the argument, and of course, what does each answer choice do in relation to the author's argument? We really have to spend some time considering how these pieces fit together. Of course, logical skill, understanding how an argument works, how we structure the premise conclusion relationship. Got to know how an argument works in order to be a solid, valid argument. And the big thing is we need a reliable strategy. A lot of critical reasoning questions tend to follow very similar formats and test us in uncertain ways. If we have a strategy that's consistent and something we can use over and over and develop skill with, that's going to make our life critical reasoning a lot easier. A few things critical reasoning is not. Some of these are pretty popular urban legends about the GRE, especially critical reasoning. First, it's definitely not word matching. Unfortunately, GRE writers are aware of our tendencies. They know how we tend to approach things. So they're very good at creating trap answers based on what they expect us to do with a certain question or what they expect us to notice. So they know that a popular strategy is to make sure we're picking an answer that's relevant to the information presented in the passage by looking for an answer that uses some of the same words or very similar wording. Of course, they know that. So they're very good at hiding the correct answer behind some different wording to make it look like it doesn't actually matter. It doesn't connect to the argument at all. And we're going to fall for those if we are only trying to figure out which answer choice most closely matches the passage. Secondly, it's not rote memorization. There's no, do these 3 things and you'll get every critical reasoning question correct. You have to approach each question individually, but we can rely on our knowledge of that specific critical reasoning type to help us out, to tell us what we need to find and what we need to accomplish with our answer choice. And you may have already encountered this if you've been preparing for the GRE. It's not about simple shortcuts. There's no way to look at a critical reasoning passage and say, all right, well, I see these 3 words and this is the conclusion. So obviously my correct answer has to have this word in it. There's one that does, so it's got to be that one. Or it's never the longest answer choice. So I'm always going to eliminate those. If an answer choice says always or never, it can't be right. In a lot of cases, answer choices that fit a specific pattern will not be right, just because, hey, with 1 correct answer out of 5 choices, there's a 20% chance any given answer choice is right if we're just purely guessing. But again, the GRE writers are clever, cruel, but clever. They're very good at realizing what people tend to do with answer choices in terms of how they evaluate them. So they know that it's tempting to say that an answer choice that makes a very black and white statement with always or never or all or none. Wow, that's too black and white. It can't possibly be right for a sophisticated argument. Usually that's going to be the case. Sometimes not, though. So if we're just following universal rules, we're going to cost ourselves some questions that we can actually get right if we spend a little bit of time thinking about them. Now, as far as how the arguments are put together, we have four main pieces to consider as we're evaluating what's presented to us in the passage. We have background information, we have evidence or premises, kind of use those terms interchangeably. We have assumptions made by the author, and then we have the author's conclusion, which for a lot of our question types is going to be one of the most important things to identify. So here we have a sample passage. I'll give you a few seconds to read that, and then we'll talk about the different kinds of statements we see in there. All right, so the first kind of statement we see in a critical reasoning passage is background information. That gives us the context we need. It sets the stage for the position the author is going to take. Just kind of tells us what we need to know in order to understand what the author is trying to do. It's not directly connected to the conclusion like a premise is. It's just simply familiarizing us with the scenario that we're about to jump into. So in this Noodle House passage, that first sentence, which defines what the Noodle House is and tells us they're opening a store in the town of Redlands next month, that's just setting the stage. That's the backdrop against we need to consider the author's argument. Secondly, we have evidence or premises, and these are the statements that are used to support the conclusion the author is drawing. One thing to keep in mind on the GRE is that when a premise is given in an argument, it's always accepted as true. So whatever we see, when the author gives us a statement of fact, we treat it as a statement of fact. We're not going to be able to, for example, weaken an argument by trying to say that one of the premises is not true. If they tell us it's true, we have to think of it that way. And you'll see premises in many different forms. Sometimes it's just a statement of fact, which is what we see here. That second sentence, it's highlighted in blue. The mayor of Redlands loves eating award-winning food. Cool. Statement of fact about the mayor of Redlands. He likes award-winning food, which, to be fair, who doesn't? In other cases, you'll see the author cite statistics or observations or studies. Evidence can come in a lot of different forms, and if you spend time practicing critical reasoning, you'll get pretty familiar with the different kinds of facts or statements that the authors tend to use to support their conclusion. Now, the conclusion follows from any premises given in the passage, but between those, sometimes we have assumptions. The author is assuming something is true in order to make the conclusion work. Now, the best way to think of these is that assumptions are just unstated premises that have to be true for the argument to work logically. Basically, it's something the author forgot to tell us that we need to know in order to think the conclusion makes sense and follows from the premises. So when we see assumption questions, our goal is to find the missing link between the evidence given by the author and the conclusion they've drawn. We need to find the answer choices that fills in that missing link that resolves the gap in the logic that we've identified. And a good way to test that is to look at an answer choice and say, well, what happens if this is not true? If it's an assumption the author has made and has built their argument on, that assumption not being true makes the argument fall apart. We now no longer have support from the premise of the conclusion. So in this case, the conclusion, which we'll talk about on the next slide, probably should have reordered that, is the last sentence. We see the keyword therefore. The mayor will love eating at the Noodle House. Now, one possible assumption we could identify here is that the mayor likes noodles. I mean, which makes sense. The restaurant's called the Noodle House. So if you're going to go there, you should probably like noodles if that's the only thing they serve, which the background told us. And we can test to see if that's an assumption that the author has made by asking ourselves, what happens if this is not true? So what if the mayor actually doesn't like noodles? Well, in that case, we'd have reason to think that she's probably not going to go to the Noodle House. If she doesn't like the food they serve, there's no point in her going there. So that points out something that has to be true. If we're going to conclude that she's going to love the Noodle House, we probably have to know something about whether she actually likes noodles. And of course, the conclusion. This is the point the author is trying to get across to us. In most cases, these will typically be located at the end of the stimulus or passage, however you want to think of it. Not always, but a good thing to look for are keywords like therefore or clearly, as we saw in the last example with figs. It's tempting to assume that it's always going to be the end of the stimulus, but as with answer choices, GRE writers know that that's where we tend to look for the conclusion. So occasionally they feel a little bit clever and put it somewhere else in the stimulus. You might see it in the first sentence, might see it in the middle. You just got to read carefully and look for clues that would tell us what point the author is trying to make. All right. So now that we've read the noodle house example, let's walk through a question together and then we'll dive into some strategy points and look at a few harder examples. So in this case, it says, which of the following is an assumption upon which the support for the above conclusion depends? So as I mentioned with an assumption, oops, hang on. There we go. An assumption question, what we're looking to do is figure out what's missing between the premise and the conclusion. So we've got our premise in that second sentence. Mayor Redlands loves eating award-winning food. And we have our conclusion in the last sentence. The mayor will love eating at the noodle house. And with an assumption question, I like to ask myself before I go to the answer choices, how convincing is this argument? Is there something that's missing? Is there a gap in the logic? Does it feel like the author's making kind of a logical leap from the evidence to the conclusion? And the thing I identified was, well, they love eating award-winning food. Does that mean they love all award-winning food? I mean, there are certainly types of food that I enjoy that there's award-winning, but there's also types of award-winning food that I'm pretty sure I wouldn't enjoy, or I know for a fact that I don't enjoy. So I feel like we're making kind of a logical leap here from just liking award-winning food to specifically liking the award-winning food at the noodle house. So going through our options here, choice A says the mayor of Redlands does not eat any meals at home. Does that have to be true for the argument to work? I mean, maybe it could tell us why they or why she would love to go to the noodle house. She just never eats at home. So a new restaurant opens. Great, that's perfect. But we can use that technique to ask, what if this is not true? So what if she actually does eat some meals at home? Does that make a difference? Well, not really. Even if she eats some meals at home, that still leaves room for the possibility that she would love to go to the noodle house. Just because she eats at home doesn't mean she never goes to a restaurant. So choice A doesn't really have much of an effect on the argument here. What about choice B? The town of Redlands has a small number of noodle restaurants. I would say not much of an effect there. I mean, we could probably stretch it and say, well, hey, if they're opening there, they feel like maybe the noodle house feels like there's some unmet demand for noodles and they're award winning. So maybe they're going to be very popular. But we can use that technique and ask, what if this isn't true? So what if they actually have a large number of noodle restaurants? Still doesn't make much of a difference, regardless of the presence of other noodle restaurants. It's entirely possible that the mayor actually will love eating at the noodle house. So as the choice A, not required for the argument to work. Now, what about choice C? Only award-winning restaurants open in the town of Redlands. Does that affect the author's conclusion? No. Again, we can use that what if this is not true technique, which in the TTP course, we call the negation technique, asking what if this answer choice is not true and seeing how it affects the conclusion. So what if not only the award-winning restaurants opened in the town of Redlands? What if there were other kinds of restaurants? Still doesn't make a difference. Regardless of what kinds of restaurants tend to open there, the mayor may or may not love the Noodle House. We don't really have reason to think that that's definitely true or unlikely to be true. Choice D, it costs less to dine at the Noodle House than at any other restaurant. Maybe the mayor loves saving money, so that's a big reason she would love eating at the Noodle House. If we use that negation technique and we say, well, what if it actually costs more to dine at the Noodle House? Conclusion could still make sense. I mean, she loves award-winning food. A lot of award-winning food is not cheap, so we don't have to know anything about the cost of the Noodle House to make an argument whether she would love to eat there. Which brings us to choice E. The mayor of Redlands is not allergic to noodles. And Jackie, you said this one was right. What did you like about choice E here? Yeah, I think that's pretty safe to say. Kind of like I pointed out with the stimulus there, we're making a big jump from she loves eating award-winning food to she'll specifically love the award-winning food at the Noodle House. We're going to conclude that she's going to want to love to eat there. We probably should know that she's actually going to be able to eat there. If we use the negation technique and ask what if this isn't true, what if it's the case that the mayor actually is allergic to noodles? She's not going to love eating at the Noodle House, probably. I mean, yes, maybe she likes to live dangerously, but we'd have strong reason to doubt the conclusion here that she loves eating award-winning food. But if the award-winning food is a kind she can't actually eat, then she's not going to love it. Yeah. Yeah. She just rolls up to the Noodle House and sits down, orders, and when her food arrives, just plops her EpiPen on the table. I too like to live dangerously. I mean, I've heard crazier things, but I feel like that's unlikely. We'd have to make a pretty big assumption to think that's the case. It's pretty safe to say that if she's allergic, we have reason to doubt that she's going to love the Noodle House. So, choice E it is. All right, questions on this one? Cool. Let's keep moving. So as far as critical reasoning questions in general go, we're going to follow these basic steps for each question type. As I said earlier, though, we're going to adjust how we approach specific types. We'll have a little bit more context for what we're looking to find or what we need to do in the answer choices. But in general, this is the set of steps that we need to follow to do a thorough analysis of a critical reasoning question. We start by reading and understanding the passage, the information contained. We read the question stem so we know exactly what we're supposed to do with that information, how we have to pull it apart and figure out what's happening. Then we analyze the statements and logic of the passage. We look at the answer choices, always a key there. And then we choose the answer that most clearly accomplishes the goal that we need to for that question type. So for an assumption question like we just saw, we're going to look to find something that has to be true for the argument to make sense. For a weakened question, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, we need the answer that gives us reason to doubt the conclusion is actually true. We're going to have a different objective to accomplish with each type, and we're going to need to keep that in mind as we evaluate the answer choices. So assumption questions, which is a good foundational critical reasoning type to talk about because a lot of questions that we'll talk about a little bit later that you'll encounter as you prepare for the GRE involve some element of finding assumptions, particularly strengthen and weaken. When an author makes an argument, there's usually a lot of assumptions they're relying on for the argument to work. So it's a good question type to start with. First up, So we said, read and understand the passage. Second step, read the question stem. And with an assumption question, you're going to see words like keywords like assumption or assumes. Pretty straightforward there. Or something like the argument depends on which of the following. Talks about depending or relying on one of the answer choices. It's a safe bet you're looking at an assumption question. Once we have that context, we go back and look at the statements and logic of the passage. Really, we want to focus on identifying the conclusion. So what point is the author making? And then identifying any premises they provided for us. With an assumption question, we also want to keep in mind that there's probably a gap in logic somewhere. So if we can find that and figure out exactly where we think the argument is a little bit questionable, we're going to be in good shape for figuring out what kind of an assumption would fill that gap for us. Then we go to the answer choices, keeping in mind again that we're looking for one that must be true. On our first pass through the answers, we want to make sure that we're only eliminating when we know that the information in that choice is not integral to the arguments. If we can say, well, I can kind of see how this would matter for the conclusion, hold on to it, give it a little bit more thought after you've gotten rid of all the easy eliminations. When it comes down to choosing between your 2 or 3 contenders, the thing to keep in mind is that there's one answer that must be true for the argument to work. Others might help the argument or make us more likely to believe the conclusion, but there's only one that's absolutely required for the argument to make sense. That's the one that we need. All right, I've got an assumption question here. So in the question, so much of the following does the author assume in arriving at the above conclusion? So I'll give you a minute to look at it and evaluate the answer choices, and then we'll discuss. Have fun. All right, so what is the author's conclusion here? Yeah, we've got a keyword there at the start of the second sentence, clearly. They were to charge a toll across the North Bay Bridge. The town of Seaford can generate enough revenue to cover its budget deficit. All right. Why does the author think that's the case? What support do we have for that sentence? 20,000 cars use the bridge every day. Cool. So we just charge a small toll for all of those cars and we're good. Do you see any problems with that argument? Is there anything that you find a little bit questionable about it? I think the questionable element of it was, okay, you're citing the number of cars that currently cross the bridge into Seaford when it's free for them to do so. Yeah, we're assuming that those cars are going to continue crossing the North Bay Bridge, either because it's the best option for them or it's the only option, but the plan really relies on that number not changing. So that's what we need to address. Going through the answer choices here. Choice A, tax rate set by the town of Seaford could be substantially increased. Does that make a difference here? No, we'd say that one is the decreases. Maybe, but we're talking about a different element here. Because we're talking, the plan is based on charging a toll. Tax rates, whether that's income tax or sales tax or real estate tax, could give us another way to cover the budget deficit, but it doesn't tell us whether the current proposed method, charging a toll for that bridge, would also cover the budget deficit. The fact that they could maybe approach it differently doesn't tell us anything about the success of the approach the authors come up with. Go ahead and get rid of that one. Choice B, if the town of Seaford does not cover its budget deficit, it will be forced to declare bankruptcy in the coming year. How about that one? Yeah, not the premise. I would say this one kind of gives us maybe a reason they've come up with the plan to charge a toll, but the reasoning behind the plan doesn't tell us whether the plan will actually succeed and generate the revenue they need. Maybe it will, maybe they won't, but the reason for adopting the plan does not tell us anything about the success of the plan. Choice C, people will continue to use the North Bay Bridge to get to Seaford even if they must pay a toll to do so. Bingo. As we said in discussing the passage, the plan relies on that number not changing. We're citing that as the evidence. Well, we just charge a toll to those over 20,000 cars, then we can make up the money and cover our budget deficit. We kind of need those cars to continue crossing the bridge. And that's what choice C tells us. Now, if we negated that and we said people will not continue, to use the bridge, and that number is going to decrease from 20,000, we have reason to question whether the plan is going to actually cover the deficit. If, let's say, 15,000 or 10,000 or 5,000 cars cross the bridge and pay the toll, is that enough money to cover the budget deficit? Maybe. I mean, depends on how high the toll is and how big the budget deficit is, but we've poked a hole in the support here that we're citing that number of cars as the reason the plan is going to succeed. If we have reason to think that that number could change, then we have reason to question whether the plan will actually accomplish its goal. And that's a pretty good answer choice for us. Choice D, the town of Seaford has been spending money on wasteful projects. It has kind of a similar issue as choice B. It could give us a reason why they have a budget deficit to cover or why they're choosing to adopt a toll plan. But it doesn't tell us whether the toll plan will actually reach its goal. So get rid of that one. And choice E is usually a pretty popular answer choice. The number of cars that cross the North Bay Bridge will not increase in the near future. Did anybody like that one? Maybe you guys are a little bit more clever than some students. Um, but this is a good example of how the negation technique can help us figure out, what's could be helpful to the argument, what's actually required. If we negate this and we say that the number of cars will increase in the near future, that gives us even more reason to think that the plan makes sense, that the conclusion is going to come true. Once we apply the negation technique, we're looking for the answer that gives us reason to question the conclusion. Choice E does not do that, so we're left with choice C. If the plan relies on a specific number of cars, we need to make sure that that number is not going to decrease enough to put the plan in jeopardy. Choice C it is. Any questions on this one? Cool. All right. We'll talk about one more question type, and I'm going to give you some overall thoughts about approaching critical reasoning and what to focus on as you prepare for critical reasoning questions. Slide. Weaken questions. And these are a good follow-on from assumptions because most weakened questions you encounter will involve identifying and exposing an author's assumption. So first step, read and understand the passage. Second, read the question stem, and some keywords to keep in mind here are weaken, obviously, doubt, vulnerable, criticize, question. Any sort of kind of pessimistic or skeptical tone in a question stem is a pretty good sign that you're probably looking at a weakened question. Next, go back to the passage and carefully analyze the statements and logic. Again, start with finding the conclusion and any premises the author has given, and identify the gaps in logic. So, as opposed to assumption questions where we're looking for what has to be true to fill that gap, here we still want to find the gap, but now we're going to be looking for something that exposes that gap and points out that it is actually a problem for the conclusion. Evaluate the answer choices, and again, be careful on your first pass. You don't want to eliminate just because you think something might not weaken. Only eliminate when you're sure. You can always come back to it and spend a little bit more time carefully evaluating the implications of each choice that you think could work. But on your first pass, just get rid of it when you're sure that it can't be the right answer. And then you pick the one that accomplishes the goal. And with a weakened question, what we're looking for is something that gives us new relevant information. So it has to tell us something we didn't already know, but it does have to connect to the information that's already part of the author's argument. And what we want is that information to make the conclusion less likely to be true. So if there's an answer choice that makes us think, hang on, I'm not quite sure that conclusion makes sense, that's a good sign. That's the one that we want. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a question here. If we look at the question stem, we see which of the following is true. Most weakens the argument above. So it is a weakened question. Start by identifying the conclusion. Evaluate the evidence in the logic the author has used, and then look for the answer choice that makes you less likely to think the conclusion is actually true. I'll give you a minute to read through it, and we'll discuss. All right, so what is the author's conclusion here? Yeah, it's that last sentence. We see that a good keyword therefore, which always introduces a conclusion. Tea shops will soon be filled with residents purchasing tea. And the evidence the author has given for that is that Silver Bolt Tea Company has opened some tea shops and they're beginning a marketing campaign that involves TV, newspaper, and internet marketing. So seems cool. They opened some nice tea shops, they're advertising them, and therefore that's going to get people to come to the tea shops and buy tea from the Silver Bolt Tea Company. Does that seem like a good argument, or do you find something questionable about that? To me, the plan makes sense. You've got this nice new chain of fancy tea shops open in the city. You want to make sure people are aware of that, but there's still a jump here. Can we accept the fact that they're doing a marketing campaign as evidence that that's definitely going to lead to people buying tea? Do all marketing campaigns succeed? Correlation could be small. That's a good point. But I think we're making the assumption that they're going to have an effective marketing campaign. I mean, maybe their ads are terrible and everyone's just turned off about Silver Bullet Tea Company. Maybe they advertise to the wrong demographics and the people who might actually buy tea don't get influenced by the ad campaign. There could be a lot of reasons that doing a marketing campaign doesn't necessarily lead to increased sales at the tea shops. So we're looking for an answer choice that points out that problem, that maybe there's an issue here with what they're trying to do. Choice A says in the city of Silverton, the law permits tea shops to operate only if they do not violate city ordinances. Does that make a difference here? Irrelevant. One of my favorite words in critical reasoning. Um, yeah, the argument that the author has given us has nothing to do with the law and city ordinances. So do we have reason to think that Silver Bullet will violate those ordinances? No, there's no indication. We just don't know anything about it. So not much of an effect here. What about choice B? Silver Bullet Tea Company spent less than half of the budget that it originally allocated for the marketing campaign in the city of Silverton. Definitely more relevant than choice A, and it at least talks about their marketing campaign. Does how much they spent of their budget matter? Maybe I could kind of see a case. We'll hold on to that one for now. We'll go to choice C. Most residents of the town of Silverton would be willing to purchase the expensive tea sold at a high-end tea shop. Does that give us reason to question the conclusion? No, I think that would be a good strengthening answer. I mean, if we know that there's a willing market, people who want to go buy fancy tea at a tea shop, that would give us reason to think that getting the ad campaign out there would actually be likely to succeed. That's something to look out for with, especially with strengthen and weaken questions. And as you see trickier ones, they love giving you a really good answer of the opposite type because they know that it's very easy to fall in love with an answer choice if it seems to make a lot of sense. If you find yourself nodding along and saying, yeah, that clicks, that makes a lot of sense to me, just double check the question stem and make sure that it makes sense in the way that you need it to be the right answer. But since we know it's a weakened question and this one gives us a reason to think that the argument actually is pretty good, we're going to get rid of that one. Choice D, because they are into active outdoor activities, most of the residents of Silverton rarely watch television, read the newspaper, or use the internet. How about that one? Weakens the conclusion. Yeah, why does that weaken the conclusion here? Yeah, it points out with the way they've points out a problem with the way that they've chosen to do their marketing campaign. They've specifically chosen TV, newspaper, and internet. If those aren't popular forms of media consumption in Silverton, then most residents aren't going to see the ads. How are they even going to know that the tea shops are open? That's a clear problem with what they're choosing to do here. It gives us reason to think that, all right, you've got a nice, shiny marketing campaign, but you've got a disconnect between the way you're marketing and your potential tea buyers. So we have a reason to think that this is not going to succeed like the author thinks it will. It's a pretty good choice. So we'll hold on to that one. And choice E, when asked in a city-sponsored survey what the city of Silverton needs most, many residents said that it needs more high-end tea and coffee shops. Would strengthen the conclusion. Absolutely. Much like choice C, that gives us reason to think that, hey, there's a market for it. We're good. Gonna work. Which leaves us with D versus B. B is tempting. It's at least relevant to the argument the author is making. The problem there is we don't know how much of the budget they would need to spend to be effective. Maybe it's only half of it. If they did a really good job of targeting their ads, it could still work. But just the fact that they've spent less than half of the budget, we have to make some assumptions to find a way that that would actually weaken the argument. But choice D does have a clear weakening effect. It's pointing out a problem with what they're choosing to do. We have reason to be skeptical that it's going to succeed like they think it will. Choice D it is. Questions on this one? All right, cool. Didn't quite get to all of my examples, but I do want to finish up here with some thoughts about critical reasoning as it gets harder and some things to keep in mind as you're preparing for critical reasoning, whether you choose to do it with us at Target Test Prep or the different source. So when critical reasoning questions get more difficult, we have a few things that we're going to see and have to be aware of as we approach them. First, understanding and identifying exact wording is going to be even more important, both in the passage and the answer choices. It gets a little bit trickier to follow the logic the author is using and understanding how the statements fit together. And of course, how the answer choices affect what the author is doing in the passage. Going along with that, trap answers get more compelling. As I mentioned with a couple of the answer choices there, especially with strengthen and weaken questions, the answer that sounds the best, makes the most sense. You read it and you're like, yeah, this is good. This really works with the argument, might actually be the opposite type. So we have to be aware that with assumption questions, you'll see a good strengthen answer, something that you read and say, yeah, this supports the conclusion, that makes sense, but it's not required. The argument can actually work without it. That's the criteria we need to meet for a correct assumption answer. And finally, as we're looking for the correct answer, it might be more subtle in how it affects the stimulus or passage, whatever you choose to call it. A couple of things to keep in mind. As I mentioned, it might be less obviously relevant to the conclusion. Remember, critical reasoning is not a word matching game. So if they can hide the correct answer behind some wording that doesn't seem to line up as easily as simpler answer choices on easier questions do, they're going to get a lot of people to ignore it. We have to make that connection ourselves and understand how the exact wording fits together. And secondly, the level of strengthening or weakening for strengthen or weaken question might be smaller. So with a straightforward strengthen question, you might read an answer choice and say, yep, this pretty much guarantees the conclusion. As the questions get harder, that effect's going to be a lot smaller and a lot subtler. We're going to have to spend some more time thinking about how much does this improve the argument. On a hard question, maybe it takes the conclusion from 50-50 after reading the author's case for it, the evidence they've given us. Maybe on a hard question, the correct answer takes us from, I feel about 50-50 about the conclusion to, I'm about 75% confidence this conclusion makes sense. We're not going to see very many that guarantee the conclusion, so we do have to look for the ones that just give us a little bit more reason to believe the conclusion is true in a strengthened question, or some reason to think the conclusion is not likely to be true on a weakened question. So as you prepare for critical reasoning, a few keys to keep in mind. First, we want to develop a consistent, reliable strategy for critical reasoning in general, but also for each critical reasoning type. The more you understand what each type is going to present to us and how to approach it, the better you're going to be at analyzing and figuring out what the passage is doing and what the correct answer should be. Secondly, careful analytical reading. And this is one of the skills that carries over most to the other verbal types, as well as some of the quant questions. Identifying exact wording and conclusions and how the statements of the argument fit together is going to be very important as you work from easy to medium to hard questions. Next, close analysis of answer choices. And this is something I emphasize with my students, and I think it's a good idea for anyone who's really trying to master critical reasoning in particular, but also GRE questions in general on the verbal side. Be very detailed in how you analyze answer choices when you're doing practice problems. One of my favorite recommendations to really get an understanding for how answer choices work and how they affect the information in the passage is to try and articulate why I think a choice is correct or incorrect. You know, it's one thing to say, yeah, I'm picking this one because I think it strengthens the argument. When you get to a level where you can say exactly why and how it strengthens the argument or weakens the argument or is a required assumption or whatever the case may be for that question type, that's when you've truly mastered the concepts behind critical reasoning. So as you're practicing, take some time to do that as you're evaluating answer choices. Look at each answer and don't just cross it off or choose it, but take some time to think about exactly why is this a good one or why is this a bad choice. Once you can get to that level of detailed analysis, you're in great shape. Going along with that, recognizing common correct and incorrect answer types for each of the critical reasoning questions we face. Again, we have to treat each critical reasoning question individually, but GRE writers do tend to fall into some patterns where if we can take advantage of our recognition of, you know, a common approach to setting up a tempting trap choice for a given question type, we're going to be much more adept at avoiding those choices. And finally, there's no way around it. Dedicated practice is a requirement to do well. It's one thing to read and understand how critical reasoning works and understand the strategy and be able to identify all the steps. On test day, you don't want to have to think through the process and, okay, step one is read the passage. Step two is read the question. Step three is figure out the logic, evaluate the answer choices, and so on. But you want to have those skills as close to second nature as you can on test day. So you can save a little bit of time, be very efficient in how you approach it, make sure you can do a good job without having to spend a whole bunch of time on each critical reasoning question. Those are my 4 keys to doing well with critical reasoning, both in terms of preparation and what you'll need on test day to do well. That'll conclude our session. Thanks for coming. If you happen to have any questions about anything, feel free to stick around and I'm happy to answer them. Before you go, let me drop some links in here. Find our landing page for our GRE material, registering for our online classes. Our next one starts on Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern. It's going to run 8 to 10 Eastern on Mondays and Wednesdays for the next 10 weeks, starting Monday, as well as the different plans that are available to you. I'll go ahead and put my email address again in there. If you didn't write it down earlier, you don't have to scroll up for it. Feel free to reach out with questions about GRE prep in general, working with TTP, individual tutoring. One thing to keep in mind, if you do sign up for the live class, you do get access to the TTP self-study course as well. It's 6 months to go along with the course, so you have plenty of time to work through the lessons after the course concludes. Very cool. We also set up a Slack channel for our individual classes, so you'll be able to discuss problems with me and with other students in the group. Very cool. One additional feature that I like about the self-study course is the live chat for support. You know, you do some practice questions, maybe something doesn't make sense, or you want to double check and make sure that the way you approached it is good, or you just want clarification on the concept that was involved in that question, or even just a concept that's presented in the lesson. Maybe the way it's described is not quite making sense for you. You can open up a chat, send it in, say, hey, I really struggled with, you know, this answer type. Can you tell me more about how to recognize it? It'll go to our instructor pool. I'm one of them. Maybe you'll have some questions answered by me or one of our other talented instructors. But it's a great way to get feedback and help with specific questions. So, lots of good options, lots of ways to attack your GRE prep. So we're going to wrap up here. As I said, feel free to stick around, ask questions. Otherwise, it was nice talking to you this evening. Hopefully you got something out of it. Good luck on your GRE journey, and please reach out, send me an email if I can be of help along the way. You're welcome.